My name is Maya. Today, I am very excited to share with you the interview I did earlier this week with Lamont Carey. For those of you who are not familiar, Lamont is a multitude of things. He is an entrepreneur. He has founded his own business, LaCarey Enterprises. He has also founded the not-for-profit Contact Visits. He is a published author. He is a spoken word poet. He's written and directed scripts and plays. He's a motivational speaker, a business consultant. He runs local writing workshops, and he's also the director at the Mayor's Office on Returning Citizens Affairs in the Washington D.C. metro area. And I can guarantee you there are things I have missed on that list because this man does not stop. I am so honored and humbled that he took the time out of his day to talk to me, answer all my questions I had for him, and honestly, it was a really great time. As much as I would have loved to have more of a conversation, I really wanted to get as much of his perspective as possible, so I really just kind of went with the questions, tried to make the most of the time that I had. So if it seems like I'm rushing or, kind of going through too fast, just know I was taking it all in. And even just rewatching the interview while editing, I am really blown away at how well he's able to answer questions very concisely and always wrap back around to the question I asked. So I'm really grateful that the first person I've interviewed is someone who has made it so easy for me to interview them, honestly. You'll also notice the whole time I have a big smile on my face because I was just very excited about it. I'm still very excited, and I'm just, again, really appreciate him taking the time to do this. But I want to be sure it doesn't seem like I'm coming off as tone deaf because a lot of the topics that we talk about are kind of dark. But before we get into it, I just want to give a little bit of background on Lamont. So at age 11, he found himself in the streets selling drugs, and by 16, he was a convicted felon. He spent 11 years in prison, but in that time, he wrote 14 books. He spent his time in prison reading, educating himself, and refining his writing craft, and by the time he was out, he was a completely reformed man. When he was released from prison, he went on to do a lot of things. The most notable tipping off point in his career was when his poem, She Says She Loves Me, was featured as a cut-up excerpt at the end of Kendrick Lamar's song Opposites Attract. From there, his career has absolutely exploded. In the interview, we talk about some of his books and poetry, and I put links in the description. So if you're interested in learning more about him and supporting what he does, all of that stuff's in the description. Check it out. I ordered Dead Before 18, and I'm very excited to get it in the mail and start reading it. If this introduction does not absolutely intrigue you, I do not know what kind of interview would. So all that being said, here is the interview. All right. Well, today I am joined by the wonderful, inspirational Lamont Carey, founder of Lamont Carey Enterprises.
LaCarey. So is my
LaCarey.
Yeah.
LaCarey Enterprises. I love that. Okay. Awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing good. Doing good.
Okay.
So, the reason I found your poetry, I think a lot of people stumbled upon it too, was because of She Says She Loves Me and how it was featured in Kendrick's song. So how did you feel when either Kendrick or TDE came to you and asked if they could sample that?
So actually I had to go to them. Fans were hitting me up and saying, congratulations, I hear you on the Kendrick Lamar song. And I'm like, huh? So we had to reach out to them.
Okay.
So yeah, they didn't reach out initially.
Oh, so you didn't find out until after the track was released that you were featured on it?
Yep. And my name wasn't on it. It was, I guess, somebody in production or somebody else whose name was on it. My name wasn't attached to the release. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that kind of sucks for you. I mean, like not being to be featured is great, but to not get the credit initially is probably kind of frustrating, because I was curious how it impacted your career. But with that little kind of speed bump, I guess, how did that go?
It introduced his fans to me because many people searched the internet and that's how they discovered me, because my name wasn't initially attached, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think I know some told me they put in, She Said She Loves Me. And my poem came up, and that's how they found out that it was me. Because I know when I was told about it, it already had over 100,000 views, And if you look through some of the messages, it was like, that's Lamont Carey, add his name to it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so I think it introduced me to wonderful people such as yourself, because you would have never, this opportunity right here would never be in existence. I don't believe if that hadn't happened.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad I dug into it, because I had done a video essay about his other album. And so I was kind of going through and listening to all of his other stuff and doing a deep dive. And then I was finally like, I don't think I've ever listened to that full poem before. And so I went and listened to it, and I cried because it was really good, really well performed. And I was just like, this poet has so much just authenticity and such a unique voice and an ability to express things that are really hard to talk about. And of course, I personally, obviously, I'm white as hell. I don't understand what it's like to be Black. I don't understand what it's like to live through what you've lived through. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later. But I think from generally what I understand, it's pretty not frowned upon, but it's hard in the Black community as a Black man to talk about your emotions and to
Right.
talk about how you feel, and especially doing poetry. So I was really curious how you came to find that that was your medium, and how what made you say, I don't care what other people think, and just go for
So
it.
one, I don't know if it's my medium, right? I still don't consider myself a poet. And in regards to being able to express emotions through the poem, so one thing I know, like you said, you're a white female, that some of the stories that I may perform in poetry, you may not automatically connect without the emotions. But one of the things that I know about performance and creativity, that emotions, we always connect to emotions, right? So if you can convey the right emotions in the right place that merges the words, regardless of the race, the language, or whatever the individual's background, the emotions will communicate what otherwise the individual may miss, right? And so when she says she loves me, for all of my work, I'm able to transport myself back to the moment that I created. I may not always be able to tell you why that poem was created, but I tend to try to internalize the pain, not only of the woman, but also of the man, whose voice is often silenced and overshadowed because of the damage that he's done. And so we never get to fully understand how he became who he became to be such a villain in that poem. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that's because I won't lie, I did like a super deep dive after I emailed you, and I went through all that stuff, and I watched like a bunch of your videos, a bunch of your old skits and things like that. And what I really love is the nuance you bring to what you've been through, and how nothing is black and white and nothing is all good or all bad. People come to the choices they come to because of different life experiences, and we can't really judge someone's past ever because we haven't lived it ourselves. So how could we know? Um, so I love that so much.
Nothing is one of the things that we do. That's one of the things that we're taught, because it adds a title. And sometimes the judgment is wrong, right? And like you said, and some, you have to be able to put your feet in somebody else's shoes, but you don't necessarily have to have lived through the experience to understand the impact that it has. Mm-hmm. So I always try to encourage audiences to be open to somebody else's experience, because you may not have experienced it directly, but domestic violence, if you live on the street with 10 houses, chances are 2 of those houses has been impacted by domestic violence, right? Somebody in your community right now may be experiencing domestic violence as we have in this conversation. And so I internalize not only from personal experiences, but from stories like that you may share with me from the newspaper. I can see a flower, but it can trigger something dark, right? and I generally run with it. So when I did a lot of my earlier work, including She Says She Loves Me, was freestyle. I don't consider myself a poet. And if you've seen any of the interviews, I was invited to a poetry event and I was talking trash about poets because they was like, lay you across the moon and all that old stuff, right? And I just couldn't connect to that because I come from a darker background. And so the host, because we was great friends, called me on the stage, put me on the spot and introduced me as a poet. And I had to make up something. And so that initially how She Says She Loves Me came about. But also I had to go back and put the statistics on it, right? Because in the beginning when I was doing that poem, women were looking at me like they wanted to beat the brakes off of me because it just ended. She says she loves me. And they was like, you beating women, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Right. So some women,
you're supposed to analyze it and get from that's the whole point. Yeah. Kind of have to spell it out for some people sometimes. Yeah.
right. And so, because I know some people that interviewed me in the past did research to find out if I killed a woman from domestic violence. Yeah. That's what some people, interviewers, did. Because they just could not believe that I could create that poem without having physically done it.
I'm sorry, but that's fucked up. that's just fucked up. So that's something I want to get into too, because I think, is your apprehension of describing yourself as a poet because poetry is extremely white? There's a lot of association with, well, and it's because it's a real thing, because people of color have less access to quality education, and therefore we associate white academia with poetry, and that's kind of just where that starts and stops. So do you feel like you don't describe yourself as a poet because you think it's so sectioned that way? And no? Okay.
So remember, I said that the host, because I was talking smack about poets, he called me up, said the next poet to the mic is Lamont Carey. I was never a poet, right? So I made up, I think at that time was my poem, I Hate This Place, right? And after the people finished, after I finished, the people clapped. And so I couldn't believe it. So I came back another time and did it. And then it was the poem, I Can't Read. And then I think, Imagine. And then She Says She Loves Me. And by then I had got the call from Def Poetry Jam. So I got the call from Russell Simmons, and then before I even had, I had freestyled the album, but that is why I don't call myself a poet. But I do know scholars, right, that study poetry don't consider spoken word artists as a poet. And sometimes there's a racial line there, but that is not the reason that I don't call myself a poet, because I came in it on accident. Then I have a poetry book, so I guess I am a poet, right?
Yeah, I'm like, no, I'm not gonna let you get away with saying, oh, I'm not a poet, because personally, in my opinion, spoken word, rap, really any type of word structures that's trying to convey a story or an emotion or a scene, that to me is poetry. And I feel like whether you like it or not, you have a poetic soul and you have a poetic style. And that's how I see it though. But I respect if you don't want to self-define that way. But on that note, I really think that there is so much impact of doing poetry personally, even if you never share it. And I think especially with emotional vulnerability, what it can do for people is really important. And I know you do a lot of community outreach and a lot of work within your community. And I think writing workshops too. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So how do you think the narrative can be changed with poetry or spoken word, or however you want to describe it, for younger people who might be struggling, who are looking to cope with their situation or their mental health or their emotional, maybe they don't have an outlet otherwise. How do you think that could help people? And how do you think things should be shifted so that's not as, looked at like something that you only do if you're really emotional or if you're really this or really that?
So, well, I grew up in school that poetry was for suckers, right? You was a nerd, you was an outcast if you did poetry. But for me, poetry saved my life. Poetry helped me build a business, 2 businesses actually. Poetry gave me the wings to do workshops, motivational speaking, poetry in other countries and around the country. Poetry helped me solve problems that I was working through within myself, right? Poetry allowed me to sprinkle pieces of me in my poems, right? Poetry gave me a voice that I couldn't find sometimes any other way. But not only when it gave me that voice, it also gave me a divider where I could say it's me or I could say it's not me. And so it depends on my level of comfort. Some of the main things that poetry does for individuals, it teaches them how to tell their story or a story. It builds confidence, right? Poetry helps individuals define their messaging. Poetry helps individuals to connect to other individuals, to groups, to community, to the universe as a whole. And so whether it's an African-American kid, a white kid, or whatever color the kid is, and regardless of their background, all of us at times feel muted. And poetry gives us that power back, whether we perform it in front of anybody else or just write it on the pages of our notebooks. Poetry is freedom. And so for me, mentioning or shaping poetry or pitching poetry as a form of freedom, of nonviolence, right? Of escape. That is what poetry does, I think, for each and every individual that takes that chance on writing one word. One word. That's what I challenge people in my workshop. Give me one word. Give me an issue. Sometimes people don't have anything to write about, right? And I will tell them, write me a poem why you don't want to be in this workshop. And they can riff it off, right? Poetry is everything. From how we communicate with our friends, how we first try to introduce ourselves or communicate with the opposite sex or the same sex, whatever your preference is, right? We put words together, and in my eyes, those words and how they flow can be poetry, prose, or whatever. So poetry is part of the foundation of how we communicate. So it's a part of our life. For me, it's a gateway to freedom and opportunity.
I love that. I love that so much. So when did you start writing or freestyling? Because I know you had said in other interviews around the age of 11 was when you started getting into trouble more and, participating in different things. And by the time you got out of prison, you were like, I'm going to write a book. So right. What's that timeline like? What happened?
So, in prison, I actually wrote 14 books. I started writing in prison, and none of it was poetry. And how it happened, me again. So in prison is probably the most creative place that I have ever been in my life. They draw, they write, they sing, they rap, they do it all. And you had a group of individuals that will battle rap. Well, not even sure if they were battling. And out of boredom, I told them I wanted to participate. And so eventually one guy told me that I sucked as a rapper, but I tell great stories, and he challenged me to write a book. And I wrote my book from that dare within like 30 days. And so I let him read it. Other people wanted to read it, so that inspired me to keep on writing. And in total, I had written like 14 books, but I've only released one of those books, and I currently have 7 books out there.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So what was your first book?
It was called Capers. So I wrote about things that I knew and things that I thought that other prisoners would enjoy. So I wrote like the book that I did release is called The Heal. It's a guy's journey, a young guy's journey through one of the worst prisons in the world. And so when I released that book, the demand for it was so huge and people were demanding like another part to it. And so I ended up turning it into a 3-part series. So there's The Heal, then The Wall, then The Transition. And the series is called Predator or Prey. So I started writing about things I thought will interest prisoners. And so they are the biggest critics in the world, but they wouldn't allow me to complete a book. They wanted the chapters or the pages I had already done. So that let me know that I had something if I could impress them.
Wow. That's intense. I can't even imagine writing a book at all, let alone in the confines of, yeah. I just think it's amazing that you've made it through that, because I personally can't fathom what that's like at all. And I also think there's a lot of misconceptions and things that we have about people when they come out of prison. And I'm just curious how you think that narrative can be changed too, with the way we talk about people when they're released from prison, or our perspective of them. And then also just generally the different restrictions, because I don't know if it was a federal offense or not, but I know for a lot of people who have a federal offense, they can't do, majority of the things they were able to do before that happened. So your thoughts on that?
So reentry. Unfortunately, people, when they think about somebody being released from prison, their fear is that we are the same person that we was when we went in. And that's how they treat us. So it creates barriers to employment. It creates barriers to housing. It creates barriers to occupational licenses. It creates barriers to getting an education. Some places it creates barriers to getting public assistance. And so, and in those places, it forces individuals who may have a real change and trying to be productive. And the goal is to be productive, but with all of these barriers, it's like you can force some of these individuals back into the darkness that they have so desperately tried to escape. But one of the ways I think that we change that narrative is begin to highlight those who have successfully transitioned into our communities despite all of those barriers, right? Because if people can change the narrative on who they think that we are by seeing who some of us have become, then they may see that opportunities exist for others to be like or chart their own path to success. But the main thing that we need from communities, from states, from governments, right, and from employers is to give us an opportunity to be employed. Because one of the misconceptions is that when people are in prison, they just sit around and talk about other crimes. But in most prisons, you're forced to work. Not just 5 days a week, but some 7 days a week. So we have already been conditioned to work. So it's really at times, it's a disadvantage once we get released because we come from these structured environments where we're in school or we have a pattern of working, to get out here with nothing to do because nobody wants to give us an opportunity. And one of the things that people who have hired people that have been incarcerated have said, they are some of the most loyal employees that they have ever had. One is because they're trying to prove to the employer that they are worthy of the opportunity. Two, that they're trying to prove to themselves that they are not who they were. And so I think the ability for our communities to see more success stories can change how they see individuals who's coming home from prison. So people that get to encounter me, they don't initially know that I'm a former prisoner. Did 11 years in prison. Violence, right? But they'll sit, have coffee, talk to me all day, invite me out to eat and the whole nine, right? But when they experience me, when the hat turns to me working, because some of these conversations, I deliberately have these conversations when I'm at events, right? And so people can get to know me. And then when I'm called to the stage to speak or do a workshop, they be like, hold up, that's the guy that was just right next to me. Oh my God, I didn't know you was. You understand? And so the goal is to show that we're human before we have to prove that we're human. Because if I come in saying that I'm a convicted felon, then I have to prove that I'm human. But if I don't open my mouth to say that I'm a convicted felon and we engage each other, you automatically know that I'm human. And then the conviction becomes second nature because I am not like maybe your image of what a prisoner or returning citizen look like.
So do you think, I mean, obviously the main issue is that we dehumanize people once they walk through those doors. So why do you think we do that? Is it fear? Is it judgment? Is it, well, I wouldn't do that, so I'm better than that person? Why do you think we do that as a society?
Because we're taught that there's a boogeyman that exists. And if you have wronged your community or society, then you should wear the mark of the beast. And I am in no way saying that if I break the law, that I shouldn't have to answer for my crime. But what I am saying, if I don't have a life sentence, if I am sentenced to a term of incarceration and I complete that term of incarceration and I'm back in the community, I should no longer be treated as that convicted person. So it's fear. But what I would request of the community to help minimize their fear is to demand some stuff from the prisons, right? Demand that we have access to an education, demand that there are incentives that are given to individuals who don't have an education so that they can enroll in education. Demand that there are trades with certifications implemented in the institution. Demand that there are trades that we can use universally in communities. Demand these things, right? Demand that we have cognitive behavior programming that's going to change our thinking, right? So believe 95% of people that are incarcerated are going to be released one day. I think that what the statistic is. So since we as a society know this, the Department of Correction is supposed to correct bad behavior. Department of Rehabilitation is supposed to rehabilitate you. And so ways to do that is to ensure the things that we don't have that we would need and for productive reentry to be productive members in the larger society, make sure that stuff is being implemented inside of prisons. And I think that's a lesson of fears.
Yeah. You had said you're never bored in prison if you don't want to be, besides working and things like that. So are there currently ways that, from what I know, you can get your GED from prison? Is that right?
Yes, most institutions, I believe, have a GED program. Mm-hmm. But the challenge is, some institutions is mandatory for you to attend if you're under 21, and some that you got to do like 90 days in the GED program, right? The problem with that is a lot of individuals that are in prison are school dropouts. Many individuals that are in prison have mental challenges, right? Many individuals that are in prison may have been in special ed, right? And assessments can be done. So assessments are done in prisons, right, to determine what level of security that you should go in, whether it's maximum, medium, right? But assessments should also be done on what kind of programming or educational needs that you have. So I think when you have individuals in a controlled environment that they're going to be in for a length of time, you have the opportunity to implement things that's going to change their thinking, build their skill sets, right? And create opportunities for them to stay engaged with communities, right? And make sure their transition is smooth and that they come home prepared, because you still have individuals that get released every day without a GED. And that's almost a minimum of what you need to have to get any job out here.
Going into a different route, I appreciate your insight very much. And I don't want to just make it about that, because I know you are so much more than just that experience.
I'm in the car with my seatbelt. I'm going where you take me.
All right. So a lot of what you write about has to do with a lot of trauma. So did that help you cope through it? How did it help you cope through it? And, mental health care wise, if you ever received any of that in prison, probably not, because I don't think people in prison get anything that they really need to have a decent life. But, how was that impactful to your mental well-being and your rehabilitation and just generally you as a person?
So in prison or out?
Both.
So in prison, because I was under 21 when I went to prison, it was mandatory that I had to attend the GED classes. Outside of that, I would not have attended because I dropped out of school, right? When I got the GED, that was my first mainstream win. So I got in the college program eventually, right? And I took business management, and I realized some of the things that they were talking about I already knew from my life as a drug dealer. I learned I had to keep my hustle, but I had to change my product, right? And so when I got into writing, well, first I got into reading books because I read my first novel, and most prisoners I know read their first novel in prison. And so what that provided me was a way to escape. So I stayed in books because I wanted to be outside of the prison walls as much as possible. And when I started writing myself, unbeknownst to me, I started solving some problems or getting some answers and better understanding not only me, but people around me, right? From my own writing. So that helped me focus, helped me cope during the worst times of my life, right? Because there are days in prison that I just wanted, that the walls were closing in and I just wanted to escape. Writing helped me escape. Now, when I got on the street, poetry breathed a new life in me. It helped me to be able to interpret other people's experiences and deliver them as they're my own. Because people are nosy, right? If I so as long as I'm saying, she says she loves me and I hit her, they're like, oh my God, he hit her. But if I'm just talking in the third person, the poem will still probably be good, but I'm not sure if it will be as impactful if I wasn't the villain. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of how it helped me mentally, it helped me to shape the communication that I wanted to have with the audience. It helped me to let people in the audience know, even though it may feel like you're the only one that's dealing with this issue, but there are so many others that are dealing with it, and your voice, how you address it, can help others. And so I just use some of my real life experiences, and I use the interpretations of other people's experiences.
Does that get tiring?
No, because I am an introvert, but when I'm working, I have to transition. And so all the stuff that I do, the speaking, the poetry, the writing, all of that helps me make friends. So poetry has helped me in so many ways. One, helped me get not only one career, but several. Helped me build a network of people of influence and people with passion and people who are just trying to find their way all around the world. Poetry literally changed my life. If it wasn't for poetry, I am not sure what my occupation would be today.
So I know a little bit, and I can only do so much good Google research, but from your words, and what is it you do? What are the two businesses you founded? And then just get more about that. Give me more about that.
So one of the businesses that I founded, I'm gonna tell you something else that I guess you didn't see, is called Contact Visits. And it's a nonprofit to assist people that are coming home from prison to successfully transition. And so with Contact Visits, I did things like cognitive behavior programming with juveniles and adults in jails, in prisons, and in communities. The other business is LaCarey Enterprises, which is the arts, the entertainment, where I release books, motivational speaking, workshops, film projects, plays. So it's more of the artistic arm of what I do. And 20 months ago, I was presented with an opportunity to run a government agency. And so I am currently the director of the mayor's office on returning citizens affairs. And so basically what I do, I advise as the mayor on barriers to successful reentry for returning citizens, right? I also connect, well, my staff mainly connects returning citizens to opportunities and services that's gonna help with mental health, that's gonna connect them to education, job training, and employment, the same stuff I talked about, right? And it's actually the same stuff that were in some of the poems I'm sure that you heard. So poetry not only gave me freedom, but it opened doors and removed barriers for me that allowed me to be in the cabinet. I'm a cabinet member in the Mayor Bowser administration and director of a government agency. Without poetry, I assure you that this wouldn't have been my journey. So I took something that I felt inside, wrote it on paper, well, first freestyled it into the universe, and it opened the doors for me to create a CD, for me to write a poetry book, for me to do workshops, for me to do stage plays, for me to do films, for me to be putting people in films and plays, to me traveling abroad and advising businesses, to now being the head of a government agency. That's what poetry did. It gave me a life.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable. How do you feel in retrospect, looking back at how far you've come? Because you've come very far.
Well, I think in every last one of us, the potential for greatness exists. And I think sometimes we get blinded by barriers, right? And sometimes we are birthed into barriers because some of the people in our circle are toxic, are hopeless, and they pass that on. But I generally don't see myself as successful because I'm always thinking that there is more that I can do. And so I'm just starting with the help of peers to say, man, look back and see what you have done and soak in that for a minute, because I'm always on go. Well, I'm trying to make sure I'm always helping as many people as I possibly can. And so sometimes it hurts me in other areas of my life, right? That I don't look back and see what I have accomplished. Sometimes I could be so focused that it damages relationships with people that I want to have relationships with. And so when I do look back, I do say you have come a long way, but I don't dwell in that because there's so much more to do.
I need to tell you that you are very successful. And my definition of success is someone who is actively going for what they care about and doing their best to take care of themselves in the meantime and make the most of each day. And you are definitely doing those things, and you definitely have been doing those things.
Well, I think some of the people that's closest to me will give you some pushback on me taking care of myself, because I still live with a frugal lifestyle, right? But it gives me pleasure to be able to create opportunities for other people. But I do have to work on celebrating myself more.
Why do you think you don't take the time to celebrate your victories or to take care of yourself as well as you should be?
So I think we are taught not to brag. And I think at one time I thought celebrating myself or mentioning what I have done was a form of bragging that people look down on. Even though that's not what I believe now, but I think what I know, I don't splurge on myself because all of this is surreal, right? This isn't the path I chose. Now, the writing the books was the path I chose. Motivational speaking, starting a business was the path I chose, the for-profit. But doing workshops, running a government agency was not the path that I chose. So I think it's hard at times for me to understand that I'm actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to celebrate something where you're not sure how in the world you got there.
That's fair. So a bit out of body and maybe a bit of imposter syndrome as well.
Well, I don't know if it's imposter syndrome because technically I know what I've done, created the opportunities for me, but the opportunities weren't my goal. Like my goal wasn't to be a poet. So that's why I say I'm not a poet, right? But I create a poem in a minute for you, right?
Yeah.
I'm out of the business on writing poems and performing poems. So it's not imposter syndrome, but it's more of this is not what I planned, but I took advantage of the opportunities as they presented themselves. Do I think I'm worthy of celebrating myself? Yes. But have I stopped to wallow in it? No, because the focus isn't about me. The focus is about creating opportunities for other people.
Interesting.
And I'm open to other people pampering me. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. So with, your past as well, you had said before that a lot of what you do is kind of a way of atonement almost.
Definitely.
Do you feel like you're driven by that still, or have you come to forgive yourself, or is it kind of a mix of the two?
It's hard to forgive yourself when you don't know the true impact of what you've done, right? I was into violence. I was a drug dealer, right? There is no measurement of the harm that I could have caused, right? So there's no way to really atone for what I've done. Do I beat myself up about it? No. I don't do that. But I do know that I have a responsibility, not just as a returning citizen that committed crimes in the past, but as a human being. And it just so happens that I focus on the population that I focus on because that is the population that I truly understand because I have been in communities with thousands of those individuals. I have been in prisons with thousands of those individuals. And I know how society sees them and how society limits them. But every barrier that I break, that means there is a pathway for them to follow that, but also should be an encouragement for them to break barriers on their own. And so if I'm atoning to anything, it is helping the people that have caused harm to the community figure out how to repair themselves and their communities and their families that we have harmed. Because we all should be able to have a better quality of life. And if I pay my debt to society and they pay their debt to society, it's the society's responsibility to allow us back in and not ostracize us. But it's also our responsibility from the lessons we learn to try to prevent others from going down that same path.
So I think it's very important to note that this was between ages 11 to 16.
Right.
Do you think that someone that young can really be accountable for those decisions when their brain isn't even fully developed?
So there are several things, right? My understanding as a juvenile was only my understanding from a juvenile's perspective. So I witnessed my parents struggle. I witnessed my community suffer. And as that juvenile, my whole goal was not to suffer as my community. My goal was to get away from them because I knew I deserved better. But being an 11-year-old kid with limited resources, limited understanding, I chose a path that was vibrant in my community. There was drug dealers all around my community. I learned how to sell drugs, not even being conscious of learning how to sell drugs. So being accountable, if there is somebody that is offering correction, then there is some accountability. But I did know right from wrong, but my understanding was fuzzy because my limited lived experiences. Now, if you have a child and your child goes in the kitchen and eats some cookies hiding in the refrigerator, there is some accountability because your child waited till you left out the kitchen, went in the refrigerator, actually tried to hide in the refrigerator to eat the cookie. So we do understand right from wrong, but sometimes in some of our communities, what is considered wrong is so massive, appears as legal, right? And so can we be held accountable to things that we do? Yes. Should a juvenile be charged as an adult and put into adult system? No. Should a juvenile be sentenced to life imprisonment? No. And what you mentioned earlier, because our brains are still developing and our brains aren't fully developed until they said the age of 24. So even when I was convicted as a 16-year-old child for the crimes that I committed, my brain was still developing. But did I commit the crimes? One of the crimes I didn't commit, but the other crimes I did commit. And I intentionally chose that as an option. But also in my defense, there wasn't a lot for a young kid that's living in poverty that I knew of for me to make money legally to take care of myself. So can we be held accountable for crimes that we commit? Yes. But should it be a life sentence? Should we be charged as adults? No.
So I am curious. I know you probably would say you wouldn't change anything about your pathway because it got you to where you are today. But how do you think your situation could have been avoided, being charged as an adult when you're still a child? I know you're doing some of that work now to try and help people avoid that, but what are some other things we as a society can do, or things that we can implement to help young people avoid going on that pathway and providing them better opportunities? Like your whole thing is, keep the hustle, change the product, which I love. I think that's brilliant.
So one, I can't say unlimited, but there should be funding that is allocated for programming for kids who have never been in the justice system. Unfortunately, in a lot of our states and counties and districts, right, for a juvenile to get access to cognitive behavior, training, workforce development, all of these other things, they have to be already involved with the criminal justice system to access programming. So my thing is on the front end, and it goes back even into the school system, because there are some that say they determine how many prisons beds need to be built based off of third grade test scores, right? So that means that we should be engaging kids in communities that have been identified where the trajectory is criminal behavior, right? Where poverty there's going to be crime. So there should be resources dedicated to programming, making sure that teachers that are working with our kids, one, understand our kids, not just immediately say this kid is disruptive, this kid has all of these ADD and all this need medication, right? Because that takes our kids out of whack. So there should be more concentration on the educational development of our kids, the brain development of our kids, exposing them to other opportunities, camping, fishing, what have you, right? Because a lot of times what's in our communities is a basketball court. A lot of times in our community, so we don't really encounter the doctors, the lawyers, the psychiatrists, because when those individuals enter their profession, they move out. But I think they still should engage. So I think on the front end, if there was more programming and more people interested in the young Lamont, then that could have prevented me from becoming the youth that was charged as an adult and the grown man that's still trying to build a life.
Yeah. A lot of it's really just down to giving kids a chance and believing in them, pretty much.
Allowing a kid to dream.
Yeah.
So Kids are the most creative people on the planet, but we will beat some structure into them, right? We will diminish their hopes and dreams. I know from the African American community, a lot of our kids pursue things that are visible where they can see the success story. So some want to be rappers, some want to be in the sports, right? And sometimes our community fault them for wanting to do those things, but what they don't understand, those kids can see that that individual came from an environment like them. And that's how they became successful. So instead of saying, we don't need another LeBron James, or you can't be the next Jay-Z, what I did when I was teaching is to expose them to all of it. Okay, you want to be a rapper? Learn about engineering, learn about managing, learn about writing, right? And that way they can say, okay, I've never known a manager or an agent that filed for bankruptcy, but I know rappers, right? I never known ghostwriters to file for bankruptcy, but I know rappers. So they might find out their niche is in the ghostwriting. Their niche is in the producing. They may not end up being LeBron James, but they can end up as the general manager, coach, ref, popcorn boy, or anything. So exposing them to the things that they have an interest in, but giving them the broader view of it, and so that they can see that there's more to it than just being able to dribble the ball or rap, but also exposing them to you, right? Who had an idea that I'm gonna do me a blog show on YouTube and did it. Because our kids got voices. How we know they got voices? Why do we think that MySpace, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of that is popular? From young people, one, communicating what they love. Now with the Instagram and all that, showing what they love. They've taken their cell phones, created movies, created music videos. We may not like the content, but we're failing to recognize the creativity in them to create something that is nothing and create a platform, or use a platform to amplify their messaging and their career goals. But instead, we want to censor them versus guiding and encouraging them. So that is how we prevent young kids from being a Lamont Carey when I was 11, between 11 and 16 years old.
I love it. I love it. Are you sure you haven't rehearsed for this?
Now, when you speak from the heart, there's no need to rehearse, right? You speak from your truth, and your truth gonna always word itself.
I love it. With your other sage wisdoms, you have one quote I heard you say was, "It's a setup, you never get out." When did you realize that?
So meaning like, because I'm trying to remember. So
sorry, I'm like I said, I dug deep into all your stuff, so I'm just something you just said off cuff, probably.
You have to give me some more context of what I said, so I could transport myself. But I will say that you don't get out in terms of, like, I'm always, so to be honest with you, me trying to save children and me trying to save other returning citizens and people from going to prison is really me trying to save that little Lamont, right? I'm trying to be what I needed for me. And I needed somebody to hear me. I needed somebody to see me. I needed somebody to tell me, not that I can't do it, but tell me how to apply myself. Tell me how not to give up. Tell me how my friends or other people around me is gonna say, you can never do that. But despite all that noise, you still have to push forward, right? I needed that. And so I think all of my work, from the poetry onto me being director, evolves around me trying to save that little boy in me. So
with your t-shirt, also, can people still get that? Are you
Yes.
still selling your merch? Yeah?
Yeah.
Tell people about it.
So they can access my merch at LaCarey Enterprises, or you could just Google Lamont Carey, right? If you Google Lamont Carey, Yahoo Lamont Carey, I think my website is one of the first things that pop up.
Perfect. So when did you come up with that phrase?
What, keep your hustle or LaCarey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, keep your hustle.
Keep your hustle, I came up with that. Remember I told you I enrolled in the college program? Mm-hmm. In prison, and I was taking business management, and they was talking about supply, demand, distribution. And I'm like, I know that, because I learned that from the streets. And so what that told me is that I already had the skill set. So I can keep my hustle, I just had to change my product into something legit. And there has the poetry, there lies the books, there lies the workshops, the motivational speaking, everything I've done, right? It all stemmed from my lifestyle, the life that I was living from the streets, even before the streets, how I grew up, to incarceration, and now to me achieving the level of things I'm achieving. I still apply, I figure out how to apply those lessons learned and give back. So yeah, keep your hustle, but change your product. I learned in the college program that I already had the skills. I just had to change my product to something legit.
How has trust changed for you? Because
Trust.
you had said, you'd said before that your experiences taught you not to trust and that you never felt safe. So how has that changed through the years?
So trust is a weird space for me. I have learned to allow people to be who they are and accept them for what they show me. And I do trust people, but I will say I still have trust issues, right? Because, I mean, I don't want to be let down, but I try to keep my word, but I know that everyone else may not be as committed to honoring their word as I am. And so I do trust, but I observe as well. Like, I trust you, but I'm gonna watch you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so a lot of part of my life I felt abandoned, right? Not properly taken care of. And so that's why I ventured out to take care of myself. And then I felt that abandonment again in prison. And so I'm still working on those trust issues. Again, I will trust you like I'm trusting you. I did your interview, right? I'm trusting that you're not gonna chop it up and I'm gonna be saying all kinds of crazy things, right? But I'm gonna watch you. I'm gonna right?
Yeah.
So, but my truth is, I'm more emotional than I've ever been because I gave myself the freedom to be vulnerable. And so with that vulnerability comes a level of trust. And I got to make sure that I'm trustworthy. So I'm a work in progress on trust.
Yeah.
Trust but verify.
Yeah. You had also talked before in another interview about getting your smile back and finding security in being able to love someone and trust someone like that. What did that feel like? Because I imagine prison is probably a very unemotional place with outside forces. I mean, you have a lot of emotion going on within, but how did that impact you?
So boys, right? I don't know if you have a son, but if you don't have a son and you plan on having a son, the worst thing that you could do to your son, nephew, or any young man in your life is to tell them that big boys don't cry. Because as a kid with a mind that's still evolving, we embody that and we learn to smother that. Because what that tells us is that we girlish, that we're weak if we show our emotions. And so we suppress. And a lot of the individuals that end up in prison have suppressed. And some of them have suppressed so much that they burst with some act of violence, right? And now they're in prison for however long that they're in prison. Some of us has been taught to suppress so much that we feel in order to feel worthy, we have to accumulate these trinkets, right? These cars, these houses to get people to like us, to be able to say things, to be able to show things that we can't verbally say. So that's one of my battles now, right? Sometimes it's a challenge for me to be in a relationship to say I love you, but I'll go build you a garden to show you because I'm still working through what I was taught that men don't show weakness and saying, I love you or you hurt me. Now I'll tell you as you hurt me, you hurt me, right? I'll tell you now, right? But at first I would just cut you off. And so I think allowing boys to be boys, allowing boys to cry, allowing boys to need a hug, allowing boys to want to kiss, allowing boys to want to be loved then women like you won't be in relationships with men saying, he's not emotional. He never tells me he loves me. He never holds my hand in public. Because you have to remember there's a connection on what society sometimes tells us what the role of a man is. And it's never that to be gushy, but they will say to be the head of his household. But as a little boy, what does that mean to be a provider? That means I got to go out and get this money. Other than that, I'm not worthy. And so my thing is that you just have to allow boys to be emotional so they won't turn into men with emotional issues.
Well said. Well said. So going back to written poetry or spoken word and things like that, do you think as a society there will be an ability for the poetry world to welcome those things into the definition of poetry? Like, my personal opinion of spoken word is poetry, rap is poetry. These things all are in the same realm, but in the official world, that still is, a lot of it's just still really gentrified. You know, there's really not a space for a lot of those things. So do you think that can come together, or do you think those things are better to stay separate in their own category, so to speak?
So with my experience, poets, people that have been trained in poetry, right, don't recognize spoken word and rap as a form of poetry. And that's a disservice to them. And so what it has forced poets to do is to create rap, to create spoken word, right? And so we had to create our own lanes to get our expression across. But the other thing that happens to spoken word artists in particular, eventually we create a CD or a book, the same thing that those that have been trained in poetry creates, chapbooks and all that. So poets, spoken word artists end up doing that. I think it is emerging. I think it's human nature how we are being taught that it is us against them. That isn't what we do. That isn't how we learn, right? But as a spoken word artist, because I had poetry scholar teachers told me that spoken word wasn't really poetry. And they, after one experience of sharing the stage with me, they learned it's the same thing, but the delivery is what changes the art form. Not the words, but the delivery. And so spoken word artists, we just add a performance to it. We add the emotions, we add the movement. And not saying that poets don't, but spoken word artists, majority of us go off of memorizing the poem versus the page. And so we're able to transform the poem into a living, breathing instrument that connects to a larger audience in a different way than the general or established traditional poet can. But we all poets. We just
that was that was a question I had for you, is if you think everyone has a poet within themselves.
Everybody got a poem in them. You got a poem in you. I'm sure you're probably already a poet, but when you pull up on that person that you're interested in, you know what I'm saying, you making sure you're using your best lines, right? And poetry are lines that we create to communicate, right? I love your hair. I love your outfit. I mean, if you put your game down on how you talk to the person that you may be physically interested in, if you put all those lines that you drop on them on a sheet of paper, it's going to be a poem.
Yeah.
So we know it's a poem.
Yeah, I love it. And how do you define poetry? Do you give it a definition at all?
No, if I had to define poetry, it would be our ability to communicate with an audience or with another person in a seamless way, right? So for me, it's a form of communication that just has a pattern to it. Even though all communication has a pattern, but poetry, for me, is easier to swallow.
One other question I forgot to ask. What did you read when you were in prison?
I started off reading, what was the first book I read? I don't remember the first book I read, but I know I started reading books like Donald Goines, Iceberg Slim. That's what told me that my stories can work. And then I started reading books on business. I rarely ever read other poets' work, but I did eventually read like some Nikki Giovanni, stuff like that. So I started off with urban fiction because it held my attention. Then I went to love stories, and then I went to business, philosophy, stuff like that.
What do you
So
like
I
to read
think
now?
the best book I read, or some of the main books I read, was The Art of War. I think every prisoner reads The Art of War, make you want to holler. But to be honest, my favorite books became The Writer's Market. You familiar with The Writer's Market?
No.
So The Writer's Market is the Bible for writers that want to turn their writing into business. So The Writer's Market put out a book every year. It has agents, managers, for everything from screenplays to poems, anthologies, magazines that you can write for, how to create a contract or what to look for in a contract. So it became my Bible on, at that time, it was how to get my books published. And then I read the Bible from cover to cover. I read the Quran, I read the Torah, and I read some stuff on Judaism because I wrote a screenplay called The Antichrist, where I brought the Antichrist into the world as one of the known figures. And it took these different religions to be able to try to stop this Antichrist from destroying the world. So I had to read books on religion to be able to represent those different religions that I wanted to have a voice in that. So I read religious books too.
Are you religious or spiritual?
Yeah, I think I'm both. I mean, the cop out for me was I'm religious, so I don't have to attach to one religion, because I liked Islam, I liked Judaism, I liked Christianity, but I know in a crisis, the God that I call upon, or the Son of God that I call upon, would be Jesus Christ. That's why I say I'm both spiritual and religion, and I talk to God like I'm talking to you. And I don't do it typically in a church or mosque building. My relationship with God is exactly how it started. Me being scared, me needing some help, and me only calling on him a lot of times is when I need help or when I'm scared. But I do know, if anybody knows me, it is God. And plus God tricked me. So I call on God because, again, this was never my path. But I went to God and said, if you help me through this, I promise you I'll change. But I thought I was going to come home, sell books, and be living on the beach. But here I am helping other people that are like me. That wasn't my plan when I was in prison. That was the road that God had for me. So I'm religious and spiritual.
Did you have that with you when you went into prison at all?
Oh, yes. When the police got behind me, woo, woo, woo. God, please don't let them people come. Yes, I did. I had it right before I went to prison. Right before I walked out. Yes, I did. I knew who to call on. But no, I wasn't active in any church or anything. But I knew who to call on in the case of emergency. I knew what glass to break. Even though he was like, look, I need you for other stuff. So I'm gonna have to send you in there for a little while, because right now you're a little crazy and you ain't gonna do nothing I tell you to do. So it all worked out.
Right on. Right on. So want to give you a space to plug what you're doing now or anything else. So the floor is yours for any of that as well.
So, the thing that I want to plug, I think, will be books. I wrote a book called The Heal that I wrote in prison, the only book out of the 14 books I wrote that I've released this far. And that book turned into a series. There's 3 books in that series: The Heal, The Wall, The Transition. And the overall series is called Predator or Prey. Now, you can buy the books individually and won't know that it's anything missing. But if you put them together, you'll see the trail of the story. I also wrote a book called Your Artist, Your Empire, a guide for artists who want to turn their dreams into a business, right? So it's for artists on how to promote yourself, how to ask for money, how you should be treated, how to protect your work. And I wrote another book called Dead Before 18, saving our boys from the streets. So it's for your viewers to have young men in their life that they want to make sure that goes on the right path. And it's just not for people that's in urban communities. This isn't people in rich communities. So it touches on things like, as it relates to females, no means no. It also talks about how you know you're being recruited to be in the gang. All of our kids experience that. It also talks about being the new dude. So some things that women may not know, that when you move your young men to a new community, sometimes they are forced to prove that they're not soft. Definitely in school, at some time in their life, they're gonna have to prove that they're not a punk, right? And so it talks about how to navigate that. It also talks about how to express your emotions in a comfortable, safe way for yourself, right? How to deal with your anger. So for me, the reason I created that book was to help our young men grow into adulthood where there's less challenges or abuse that they could possibly run into. So it's supposed to be a guide away from all of that. I wrote another book, a poetry book called Reach Into My Darkness. I Hate This Place. And it's a lot of you all's favorite poems, but it's also poems that I have never read aloud in my life. So it's a treat. And they're using it in some schools in New York. I recently released a book called Laws of the Street. And it's another series. Originally, I wrote that book as a TV series, and then I turned it into a play, and it was shown on the Kennedy Center, the John F. Kennedy Center, like 3 times. So I decided to take the TV series and release it as individual books. So what I encourage your listeners to do is go to LaCarey Enterprise. You can even go to lamontcarey.com and it will take you to my website. And just know that it isn't about where you start at. It is more about where you're trying to go, but you have to accept you and not really rely on others, because others will shape you in a way that they think you should be. But sometimes you gotta trust that the things that you believe in and the things that you want to create for your own life, you're capable of it. Because if you look around the room that you're in, at one time, it was somebody's idea. It was the crazy idea because it didn't exist. And now we have houses and everything that falls in the house. We have glasses and clothing, braces, and all of these things that didn't exist at one time. But somebody had an idea like your viewers, right? An idea that seems out of this world, but that one idea that they have can change the world for the better. And so that's what I'll leave your audience with.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you again so much for your patience while we corresponded over email for like 2 weeks, and I took like 5 days to get back to you.
It was on me too, because being a government official, I still have to get stuff approved, even if it's for my personal business, to make sure it's not a conflict.
Okay.
So we worked it out. We here. And I hope it was a great interview for your listeners. And they can reach out to me. They can email me at Mr. Lamont Carey at gmail.com and I'll respond.
Perfect. Great. Also, I did swear in this. Is that okay for your...
You did what?
I swore.
You swore?
Yeah, with you having to get things approved and things like that. Is that okay that...
Like, what you mean, like you cussed?
Yeah.
Why you... yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I didn't know how, like, official your...
It wasn't like you said nothing crazy that's going to get both of us in trouble.
No.
Swear all the time. The best of... You get any one of us angry, we'll swear, but we're good. I appreciate the opportunity. Reach out. Let's see what else we can do.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
All right. Bye, love.
Bye.